People have been holding back on some of the balls, so I haven't had to juggle all of them yet. So thank you to Neil and to Tina and to Stephanie and to the staff here who've been handling this. And I'm learning to create the file of things that Jane always did, like make name tags up ahead of time. So thank you all for writing your own name tags today. But I will learn as we go. Speaking of new and learning, I'm going to actually read a scripture for us today to give us into the tone of our conversation for this morning from the Gospel of Luke. Then the Pharisee said to him, John's disciples, like the disciples of the Pharisees, frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink. Jesus said to them, you cannot make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? The days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from the new garment and sews it on an old garment. Otherwise, the new will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new wine, but says, the old is good. The church is one of those wineskins, and we have to figure out if we're going to be old or new and what wine we're putting in. So Nathan will be guiding us through a lot of that today. Before I introduce him, I'd like to have us gather our thoughts in prayer. Gracious God, we come before you today with hearts eager to learn and minds that are open for your wisdom. Fill us with your Spirit and enable us to hear the wisdom that Nathan is about to share with us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So Nathan I need more caffeine. Nathan Kirkpatrick, say that 10 times fast, Nathan, comes to us from Raleigh, North Carolina today. He's the managing director of Alban at Duke Divinity School in Durham. And to make this so I can actually read it. In this role, he's facilitated retreats for clergy and other nonprofit leaders. He's designed educational programs in the master's and doctoral programs of Duke Divinity School, and he's consulted with senior leaders around the United States and abroad. He has degrees from Wake Forest University, from Duke University, and he's a doctoral candidate at the University of Durham. And he's studying professional development and moral formation. That's pretty impressive right there, just that wording alone. He serves as the priest associate at the Episcopal Church of the Advocate in Chapel Hill. So he's more than bivocational. He's probably trivocational at this point. But we're going to be hearing more of his wisdom with us today, and he's just a really good guy I've gotten to know already. So, Nathan, you're on.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be back in the Lone Star State. My dad at least, grew up in Texas. We won't get into the debate between Dallas versus Houston. Let's just say he didn't grow up in Dallas. So his loss, right? But one of the great gifts of my childhood was every summer I would get to come and spend about a month in Texas. And so in many ways, Texas just feels like home. And I noticed yesterday, driving the streets again, it felt like being home. And so thank you for that. I will say, I have not missed the traffic on I-35. However, never will. But it's good to be with you. I've been looking forward to this for so long. To tell you a little bit about how this day came about, I guess it was a day last year. I was trying to balance these 3 vocations in my life. And I wrote a piece for our magazine, faithandleadership.com. And I wrote a piece entitled, Recalibrating Our Expectations for Part-Time Clergy. In part because what I realized was I was being undone by the tyranny of the shoulds. We'll talk about that this afternoon, the tyranny of the shoulds. All the things that I felt like I needed to be doing, all the things I felt like I should be doing to be a good priest, to be a good employee, to be a good person at home. I felt like all of it was just too much. So I wrote a piece about how is it we begin to think with our congregations about what's realistic ministry in these times. What does that look like? How do we find balance and health and life for our souls? Frankly, the piece had a lot of questions in it with very few answers. But somebody here in your Synod office read it and said, the questions you're asking are the kinds of questions we're also wondering about. Would you be willing to come and wrestle with us for a day? Well, sure. So what I hope we can do today is wrestle together, to think about the shape of faithful and sustainable ministry, to think about what it means to engage in ministry in life-giving ways for ourselves, but also for our people, and to find the balance between answering God's call in our lives and also equipping the saints for the work of ministry. So what is it we have to hold, and what is it we have to give back to their hands? Does that make sense? Part of what I love about Alban, part of what I love about the fact that the Alban Institute is now housed at Duke, is that Alban didn't begin with certainties. Alban never began with statements of fact. Alban began with hunches, with questions, and with a single conviction. The conviction was this: you are not alone. Whether your congregation is dealing with the intricacies of strategic planning, or you're facing intractable conflict, whatever is going on in the life of your church, what Alban's great gift was to say, you're not the only one. There's another church out there that's trying to figure out what it means to be church today. There's another place out there that's trying to wrestle with the same kinds of questions you're wrestling with. And wouldn't it be great if we got people who were wrestling with the same questions in the same room, and we started to figure out some answers that could work in our contexts? And I could learn from you, and you could learn from me, and together the church would be improved. The witness of the church as a whole would be stronger because you and I are working together to solve a mutual problem. Part of what I love about this idea of you are not alone, part of what I love about this idea of learning from one another is that it breaks what usually happens when clergy get together. Now, I don't know how you all are together, and you all are probably not this way. But I know when I get together with my fellow priests, oftentimes we spend a lot of time bragging and posturing with one another. Oh, well, we had so many people show up at the youth group, right? Maybe it's just Episcopalians. Okay. And then when we're not bragging, the other thing we're doing is we're complaining. Oh, you wouldn't believe so-and-so. This person is driving me crazy. And then, of course, in addition to bragging and complaining, the third thing we're always doing is eating. Right? Okay. It's good to know some things are universal in the church. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about saying you are not alone. Here's the thing about saying you have wisdom the rest of us need, and we have wisdom you need too. The thing about it is it means we're not bragging. We're not complaining. We're coming to one another as equals. We're coming to one another as people with different experiences, but each experience is valuable. All that we do, all that we have experienced in ministry is worth sharing for the good of the whole. And so today, part of what I hope we can form in just a few hours is a learning community together, where we can learn from the wisdom that is in the room, and really my job is going to be to spark you to share what you already know. My job is to help you mine what you believe and to help you name what it is you've experienced, and to make the room, frankly, safe enough for you to acknowledge what you don't already know. To acknowledge what it is that you're still wrestling with and that you're still wondering about. And that if we can wrestle and wonder in a really great way today, then that's a good gift to one another. And let me just say, it's worth my time to get on a plane, and I hope it's worth your time to drive here. But in order for that to happen, we need to mark the space in a slightly different way. In order for us to be a learning community to each other and for each other, we need to be together in a different way. And so I would suggest the following as what we might call touchstones. I hate the phrase boundary markers, ground rules. No. These are not boundary markers. These are not ground rules. They're just touchstones. They're ways we're going to be together throughout the day, and I hope ways that we can be together in alternative ways to how we normally are. First, and you've already done this beautifully, we will extend and receive and presume welcome. We all learn best in hospitable places, in places where we can show up and be welcomed and received. This is true for congregations too, right? That people do their best soul work. People show up in vulnerable places when they don't have to worry about whether they're going to be received or not. And so in this space, know that you are welcome here. And to the extent that you can welcome one another, I encourage you to do that. Second, this is hard. Be here and not there, wherever there may be for you. So to the extent that you can, silence the cell phone. To the extent that you can, close Facebook. To the extent that you can, set aside the pastoral care question that's just burdened your heart. Set aside the council meeting that you've got coming tonight that you don't want to attend either. To the extent that you can, be here. And be here with all of who you are. Be here with your successes and your failures. Be here with your wonders and your convictions. Be here, not there. I learned to facilitate from a Quaker, which was a great gift, because I'm not really good at silence, and he was a little too good at silence. But in this space, we're going to try and let silence be a gift. Throughout the day, you'll have time talking at your tables with one another, and we'll shake up the tables throughout the day. At your table, if somebody says something and you're not sure how to receive it, let silence receive it. Let silence have a turn. For many of us, we fill our lives with noise, and so silence is a welcome and unanticipated gift. And so throughout the day, we'll have some times when we can just sit in silence with one another. And actually receive the gift of not having to speak and also not having to listen, so that we might listen to a still small voice. We will seek first to understand and then be understood. St. Francis got it right, didn't he? That part of what we want to do in this room is to listen deeply to the other before we aim to speak again. So we want to actually keep listening to the other person and to, in the words of Parker Palmer, to hear them into speech. If the going gets rough, turn to wonder. This is my favorite one. It's a little bit like getting on a plane. Though we never anticipate a change in cabin pressure, should one occur, an oxygen mask will fall from, no. Though we don't anticipate the going getting rough, if somebody says something that you disagree with, rather than engaging, let me invite you to turn to wonder. What is it about what this person just said that's stirring in me? What is it about their conviction that I find maybe even off-putting? Likewise, if you hear somebody say something that you really agree with, what is it about that? What did they just name for you that you need to remember when you go home? So, if the going gets rough, if the going gets great, turn to wonder. Then we learn from our AA brothers and sisters. If what needs to be said isn't being said, say it. We'll spend some time this morning talking about trends in the life of the church, what we are observing at Alban, and how that's shaping congregational life. If you're noticing a trend that I didn't name, say it. If there's something that I've missed, I'm not omnipotent. Let's just clear that up right now. I don't think any of you thought I was, but say it. If there's something that needs to be said and you're not hearing it, say it. Offer it to the room because your wisdom is needed here. Finally, even though we're only together for a day, let's attend to joy together. One of the perils of the church's present social situation, one of the things about the fact of declining membership, declining money, all of these things, is that we come together and oftentimes we just seem so sad. Pope Francis is exactly right, that part of what we have to do is recover a sense of joy. You remember G.K. Chesterton's great line, where he said, "Angels can fly because they take themselves so lightly. Satan fell from force of gravity." Isn't that a great play on words? Here in this space, let's enjoy each other. Let's enjoy the fact that we get to do this amazing thing week in and week out. We get to speak on behalf of a God who hasn't shut up in talking to God's people in a long time, and that God still has a word of hope and healing and life, and we get to be bearers of it, which means that's pretty exciting. That's the good stuff. And so when we come together, let's be happy and joyful about the fact that this is our calling, this is who we get to be, and what we get to do in the world. Any questions about that? Any pushback? Anything you want? All right. Well, here's how the day's going to go. At least in my imagination. This is up to revision. Yes, ma'am. Oh. That's okay. We're going to take it as it comes. How about that? All right. So this morning, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the trends and patterns that we at Alban are observing in the life of the church. In many ways, this is an opportunity for you to, in the language of Ron Heifetz, get on the balcony. Get on the balcony. For many of us, in the day-to-day of ministry, we're so busy thinking about what's coming next. We're so busy worried about this concern or that concern that we're spending all our time on the dance floor, and we never actually get on the balcony and see the beautiful dance that's unfolding around us. And so in many ways, this morning is a chance for you to get above your congregational context, to think about what's happening in the church more generally, and to see how your congregation fits into what's happening around other congregations around the church broadly. You are not alone. This is your chance to hear how you are not alone, and also to reflect on what's shaping the life of the church today. This afternoon, we'll spend some time thinking about how wicked problems, not just complicated problems, but wicked problems are shaping our life. We'll spend some time talking about what does it mean that more and more clergy are part-time, bivocational. We'll spend some time talking about how do we define expectations and how do we set our own boundaries and expectations for our life together. How is it that we want to be engaged in this ministry? So that's the quick flyover of the day. We'll take breaks, and I hope one of the things is that there will be lots of conversation around your table. I hope I can spark that, and if I'm not sparking it enough, raise your hand. If you want to talk to the people around your table more than you want to hear me, tell me. I will not be offended, I can assure you. The other thing in that is to say a lot of the sentences you're about to hear sound like they end in periods. They do, but these are also assumptions. These are our best guess of what's happening, and so we need your wisdom. We need you to reflect. Does this describe your situation or does it not? Does this accurately reflect what you're seeing? And how is it that Texas really is a whole other country? And how is it that even the church in Texas is a whole other country? And so how is this part of the world actually different than the church in other places? Any questions at this point? Yes, ma'am. Yes, you will. Yeah, so don't kill yourself taking notes. Yeah. Other questions? All right. Well, let's get going. Let's think about trends and patterns that are affecting congregational life today. Now, many of these trends and patterns were first identified for us at Alban in a recent publication called the National Congregation Study. Has anybody seen this? You've heard about it? So it's run every decade by sociologists at Duke. And part of what they do is they aim to do the most comprehensive survey of congregations in the United States to get the best picture we can get of what's actually happening. The nice part is they've now run it a few times. And so part of what we now see are what's happening over time in congregations and not just what's the split second. Here's the snapshot view. We're now actually getting some video. We can see this is actually the trend. This is the pattern. And so I want to highlight at least 4 trends to you from this. The first is we're noticing changes in how we gather. That there's a changing nature of congregating in the United States. That part of what we're seeing are, in the words of Rowan Williams, both established forms of congregations, which I imagine most of us in this room serve. But then there are also things called fresh expressions, these alternative congregations, these different ways of gathering that are in many ways actually redefining what it means to be a community of faith in this particular time in history. So, let's note some things. First of all, the average churchgoer in America attends a large church. The average churchgoer in America attends a large church, here defined as having over 350 in worship on Sunday morning. How many of your congregations have over 350 on Sunday morning? Okay, I'm speaking to my people. If there were a whole host of over 350s, we were going to have problems, but this is good. Now, so this is the interesting part. The average churchgoer goes to a big church, but the average church in America is small. The average church in America is actually small and getting smaller. In the decade plus, between 1998's congregational study and 2012's congregational study, the average church size in America slipped from 80 to 70. That's attendance. And so what we notice is that the average congregation is getting smaller, even as more and more people are going to big congregations. And so we have a disconnect here. For all of us who are serving these smaller sized congregations, we don't have the market share, quote unquote. And you see the statistic up there. Half of all churchgoers belong to the largest 7% of congregations. And increasingly, that large 7% of congregations are non-denominational. Can you name that in Dallas? Oh, yes. Now, how many of you are from northern Louisiana? Anybody? Yay, welcome. Okay, what's true in Louisiana, in the northern part? Do you have large non-denominational congregations? Okay, all right.
They have one in Bryan Shreveport, it's fairly just called the Simple Church.
Well, isn't that nice? Because, I hate complicated church.
They worship at the convention center, and on Easter they worship in the Century Tel Arena.
Ah, yes. Because nothing says Easter like a stadium. It keeps it simple, yes, it does. When you can buy a corn dog on your way in, yes, you know you've arrived.
Movie theaters.
Ah, okay.
They handed out drinks and popcorn as you came in.
Yes. Jesus is so grateful he was risen from the dead on Easter, isn't he? So this begins to shape. I'm sorry, you're getting my snark already. We got a lot of hours and you're already getting the lines. So, sorry about that. Good. Again, with my people. So part of what also this begins to suggest to us, though, is what's in the imagination of our people. Part of what this begins to raise for us is if you drive around town and everywhere you see the bumper sticker for the megachurch, and your congregation is small and getting smaller, what are you going to feel? Yeah. Would you do that again? Yes. Right. So is there a reason some of our congregations are beginning to feel, shall we say, inferiority complexes? Because I'm sorry? Defeated. Yeah. And yet, at least in my context, a lot of our smaller membership congregations are the ones who have stuck it out. They're the ones who are actually bearing witness to the fact that there is life in small towns. And it may not look like what it was, but it sure isn't gone. And so I was telling Chris earlier, for my first parish, which was older than 125 years, they've stuck around. And they have proclaimed good news on that corner for a long time. And chances are, unless the economics, which we'll come to, get them, they're going to be doing it for a while. But they do feel a certain shame, a certain guilt about what's wrong with us. Why is it our kids graduated from high school and didn't come back to town, and certainly didn't come back to this church? And so when we start thinking about how we gather as Christian people, part of what we have to acknowledge is that for those of us who serve smaller membership places, we're serving hurting people. You know this. Because not only are economic realities changing in their lives, not only are their communities changing, but now even church feels like we're not even doing it right. That's a lot. That's a lot for somebody to take on. We also saw this phenomenon in the National Congregation Study, a rise of multi-site congregations. 10% of churchgoers now worship in multi-site congregations, where if this was one, I'd be here by hologram and be preaching to you from some video screen from my secure, non-disclosed location. Well, there's that. Don't tell all the secrets. But, what does this start to mean? This means notions of ecclesiology are changing. Theologically, what does it mean to be in pastoral relationship with people that you're not even in the same room with? What does it mean to be part of a network of a 5-campus behemoth? What does that mean for the life of the body? Now, if you're like me, I see that statistic and I go, yeah, the Church of the Advocate is not opening a satellite location downtown. This is not who we are. But what about my people when they hear about the church that is? What happens when this is what people are coming to expect, and every one of those campuses has a boy band and a fog machine, and worship is more dynamic there than I can ever hope to be? What happens? This is why this data at first seems really cold and clinical, but it starts to actually show the landscape of what's going on in the church and, frankly, some of the challenges we're up against. So it's not just a question of are you full-time or part-time. It's this whole ecology that we have to consider. What does it mean to be church today? How are these things, how are these numbers starting to change what it means to be church? There is good news, yes.
How many of those churchgoers migrate among the sites, or do they stick with one and that's their location?
That's a good question. I actually don't have numbers on it. Anecdotally, what I've heard is they go to whichever one is the newest with the best boy band. Sorry, snark, here it is. Location plays in somewhat. The thing we also need to remember about multi-sites and mega churches and big steeples is while they have huge front doors, they have a bigger back door. If you've paid attention to Willow Creek's self-research, Part of what they know is that they weren't doing a great job with Christian formation, and so people would drift in, stay about 18 months, get a little bored, they would have heard all the sermons, and then they drift out. This is still the trend in megachurches, is that people have a tendency to stay about 18 to 24 months before the next megachurch opens down the street, and then we all migrate to the new boy band. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
And a couple of comments. I think like with the one that you also have multi-site stuff. And the other thing is that finding joy is so much. And so where does the Christ stop? Because they don't celebrate all of Easter. They don't do the pain that much. They go to the joy.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, the place we really saw this was after like 9/11, or we see it after Charleston, or we see it after Orlando. Part of the deficiency, don't quote me on that, part of the deficiency of the theology that gets preached is if you don't hear the Psalms of Lament, you don't have a grammar or vocabulary for what happens in your own life when all the horrendous things happen. I mean, this to me is one of the great gifts liturgical traditions bring, is I don't really like the fact that I have to pray for my enemies, but the prayer book makes me. I mean, to be crass, this is part of what I needed a liturgical tradition to do in my own spirit. Yeah.
Oh, but on the other hand, this is filling a void where denominations are failing.
Oh, yeah.
Because when you plant a church, the odds of it actually taking down are very small. And what the multi-site churches are doing is they're taking existing DNA from a previous church with the resources and being able to plant a new church.
Mhm.
The resources most starting churches would never bring.
Yeah. Oh, that's very true. And one of the dangers, I don't know if the Lutheran Church has done this as much as certainly the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church to some extent. The gift of new church starts. On the one hand, new church starts are great. You get a lot of energy, you get a lot of excitement. But part of the problem is you also get a lot of people through the doors who are deeply wounded, who actually want to shape the community after their own pathology and dysfunction. And this is one thing that the multi-site puts a control on. We're not going to have wounded, dysfunctional people shaping an entire community. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay.
It could be a wounded, dysfunctional person shaping the whole community.
Oh, yes. And probably a narcissist. But that's the fun. Yeah.
That leads right into what I was wondering about. How much of this do we consider to be sort of like the celebrity pastor, well, they're not even a pastor, the celebrity preacher, leader, the cult of personality?
Yeah.
That, I mean,
It's certainly how megachurches build. Because and frankly, and I'm quick to judge, let me also say, part of what we can learn in the main line is we can learn a lot about communicating the gospel from these celebrity preachers. Because there is a way that they are finding to communicate truth, even if I sometimes theologically disagree with them, they are finding a way that speaks to people where they are. And that's a real challenge for me.
Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes,
I mean, it actually, not to be melodramatic, it kind of breaks my heart that there are so many people who want to know that God loves them and just roots for them, that they're flocking to Joel Osteen to the tune of 16,000 on a Sunday. I think we try and do it, and we're lucky to get 80. There's something about how he's communicating, God is for you, that I have room to learn from him. Yeah.
Another totally different. My mother's at assisted living at Westmore. And his name is J3A3 Davis, but you can say J Davis. He's with the Walk-In Church. And so anyway, he started there. He now has 15 senior living places because nobody wanted to walk in and, recharge seniors. And he's got that energy, guitar and singing and
Yep. Frankly, this is the reason my mother became a pastor at 57. because no one would come and visit her parents in the retirement center. And so she pursued, and we'll talk in a little bit about alternative theological education. She pursued an alternative theological education, became a United Methodist pastor, and her ministry, the first 4 years, was entirely in assisted living care centers. Yep. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I loved about Mom's ministry, and I still do love about it, is when everybody was saying, we have to get young families. Mom ended up with bringing like 200 people into the church rapidly, just because this was a population, nobody was visiting the nursing homes, and nobody was talking to the caregivers about how hard it is to be a caregiver. And she opened up space for that conversation. Some of you have done the same thing. Many of you have done the same thing, I'm sure. And so, it's the mistake to believe that the only way the church grows is through young families with kids. I mean, there's no shortage of people who need a church and need a community that loves them. All right, there was good news in how we gather. I think this is great news, actually. Only 11% of churchgoers were in an all-white congregation in 2012 versus nearly 20% in 1998. Our congregations are becoming increasingly racially and ethnically diverse. Congregations that are, for lack of a better word, monochromatic are actually fewer and fewer. That's hopeful, because it actually means we're reflecting our communities more, because we know something about the trends and patterns of who's moving into our communities. Now, many of you are still serving, I would imagine, all-white congregations, or principally white congregations. This is changing. And so that's a good thing. That's a good sign, and it bodes well for the future. All right, this is the eye test for the morning. Part of what is also changing as we talk about how we gather is what we do when we gather, how we worship together. And these are changes in percent in congregations saying that they're doing it. Notice the first, 9% fewer congregations have singing by a choir. How many of you have a choir? How many of you had a choir? Okay. So not quite 9% in the room, but pretty close, actually. 10% gave up bulletins, programs, compared to where they were. Dare I ask? How many of you have a bulletin? How many of you had a bulletin, but got rid of it? Okay.
Well, that's what I was going to do.
Oh.
We have 2 services with the bulletin and 1 service without.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So you notice part of what this starts to point to is that there's an increasing informality. We don't have the robed people sitting behind you on Sunday morning quite as much. We don't have the walk-in and everything is contained in a service leaflet. Projection equipment up 23% from 98 to 2012, a trend I wish we could reverse, but sadly here to stay. Testimony from members. Increasingly we have lay testimony in services. You see that was up 7% in congregations. Saying amen, up 6. Jumping or shouting? Is that your congregation? Shouting? Okay.
We have shouting and amens, but I have an all African-American congregation.
Great. Yeah, that's not me. Amen. Raising hands in praise, 14%. Applause up 10%, using drums up 14%, and it was a bad decade and a half for the organ, down 11%. How many of you still have an organ that gets played regularly? Yeah. And some of you never had an organ. Yeah, that's us, actually.
I wonder if some of that statistic deals with the fact of what goes on in college universities with people in music programs, maybe it's just not existent.
Yeah.
Every university is probably one of the biggest college universities in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Huge music program. They have 4 majors in one.
Yeah.
4.
The number of
30 years ago, they had 4.
Mm-hmm.
the number of music schools that have dropped
Well, the other thing that I also want to put together is I want to weave some of these numbers together, actually. Because if you no longer have a choir and you're singing with an organ, it's harder to carry the hymns. And so part of it is these numbers can't be understood apart from each other. That some of these are overlapping trends that start to explain each other. Like if worship is becoming more informal generally, and you have people saying amen, well, it's not that terribly far from going from amen to this. And so, these things come in waves. Yeah.
One thing in a projection equipment, you need to now add theory. I now just got hearing aids, and it's very subtle, your brain does not realize that if you're in the car and the radio's loud, but all of a sudden it hurts, if it hurts, that means your brain is telling you you lost your hearing.
Yeah.
You need to go get when you get to mention. So, the Bluetooth also, so now you need to have some stuff, tweaking with it.
Yeah. They're meaning specifically this kind of thing with like words on a screen, like the hymn words on a screen. But yes, I mean, one of the questions, and this frankly is a huge question for all of our congregations going forward, is what are we doing in terms of disability access? I mean, most of our congregations are not really well equipped for someone who's either visually or hearing impaired. And so what would we do? Now, some of you are ahead of that curve. That's great. Keep going. And then teach the rest of us, because a lot of us are playing catch up. Yeah, Neil.
I don't want to use this projection equipment, but as you break it, we have the ability now to go back to all the ancient artwork the churches used, which is now all public access.
Yep.
And to use the way that the churches use visuals to tell story as part of what we would do in our normal proclamation. Using that image as part of the proclamation.
Yeah. I was in one congregation where they used it with incense and Taizé candles. So like the whole place looked like it was ablaze, and then like here was this like 14th century masterpiece. Yeah.
With visuals, you get to change the stained glass windows every week.
Yes, you do. Absolutely. So part of this, and we can spend a lot of time, and there are more statistics if you are interested in who's added a praise band or those kinds of things. We can add it. I just want to note that as a whole, American congregations have become more informal and expressive in worship. That this seems to be the trend we're moving in, which for all of us in liturgical traditions raises some questions. We have great ability to engage senses, to be participatory, to be the kind of community that can engage in these multisensory ways. The question is, will we? And how do we do it with integrity? So this raises some questions for us. Yeah.
Our churches, on average, the ELCA, or the idea of welcome, inclusivity, welcome gay and lesbian, this is
Yep.
part of what we've been trying to move forward and become. But are we with the grain or are we against this on average for the definition?
So what the survey shows is that more congregations are LGBT friendly and welcome LGBT persons into leadership roles, which would sort of suggest that we're following society as a whole. There are fewer congregations that, from 1998 to 2012, there was a decrease in congregations that said if you were an LGBT person, you could not be in leadership.
So where in that statistic or data, most of the, at least down here in Texas and a lot of the South, most of these mega churches that are non-denominational are really evangelical Baptist by
Yep.
any other name.
Yep.
So considering their stances generally, how does that work out?
Well, but so part of what we have to remember when we're looking at this data is they count as one. So when we talk about do you accept LGBT persons into leadership, well, they have as much voice as your congregation does on that. So in the statistics. Now, if you did it as a like per capita, per worship attender, my hunch is, and I think the data bears this out, that this is a place where congregations are still evenly split.
Because we have a lot of large African American mega churches, and
that are,
And they are definitely anti-LGBTQ.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
With that, as far as the statistics go, the question, was it per congregation or per denomination?
This is per congregation across, yeah.
But there is also a growing trend of newer evangelical mission starts that are very vocal about being open-sourced. So it's just an interesting.
They're just so all go. I'm joking.
They're here.
Yeah.
Right in this area.
Yeah. Yeah, my hunch is we have probably another generation, and then that's not going to be a divider among congregations. Yeah. Oh, we're getting there. A preview of coming attractions. Prepare to be disappointed. Yeah.
I have three questions.
Yes, sir.
Your earlier slides showed statistical analysis, and one was 7%, one was 11%.
Uh-huh.
What about the other 90%?
Where are?
Church goes.
Let's see, here?
Yeah.
Okay, so about half of all churchgoers, so 50% or so, belong in one to 77% of congregations, which means roughly half of all churchgoers attend 93% of congregations. place where they could show up and actually lead in a different way than how they came. Now, we'll see where they find that in just a minute, but that's what they wanted. They wanted some way that their life was changed because of their participation. They also wanted social transformation. They didn't want to just belong to something. They wanted to belong to something that mattered in the community, that mattered among the people. They wanted something that was actually in the world, changing the world for something great. Fourth, they wanted a place where they could find purpose, where they could find meaning for their life, where they could find direction and fulfillment, a place that told them, you know what? Your life matters, and this is how. And let us help you. Let us help you figure out how you want to make a difference in the world. We wanted a place for creativity and imagination, a place where things came alive in them that had been dormant, and that people swarmed off each other, and that there was this whole energy and excitement happening every time they gathered. No problem. Last but not least, they wanted accountability. They wanted people to hold them accountable in particular ways. They wanted people who were invested enough that they would actually say, you know, you promised you were going to do X, Y, or Z, and you didn't deliver. Or, well done. You said you were going to do this, and this is how you succeeded, and look at what happened because you did. Now, for all of us churchy folks, we go, well, yeah, we got all that. We got that in Sunday school, and soup kitchens, and Eucharist, and we've got it. What's wrong with these kids that they're not finding it here? Right? That's the defensive tendency. The defensive tendency is that we say, look, it's happening. This is what happens every time we gather with fellow Christians. We believe in community and personal transformation and social transformation, and we help people find their purpose, and it's a creative, energetic place, and imagination comes alive here. And don't you want to be part? Because we'll hold you accountable, won't we? And yet, they're driving on by. And where are they going? These two div students identified 10 places. Everything from Soul Cycle and CrossFit to the Millennial Trains Project, where you get on a train in San Francisco and ride all the way to Washington, D.C., learning about community transformation along the way, all the way to Texas's very own Camp Grounded, which is a summer camp for adults. You've been there? Well, we can sign you up. Okay. These are the 10 places that they profiled as examples of what millennials are looking for and what they're finding in alternative communities. Now, we don't have time to break down each of the 10, nor do you really want me to. But let me say this, read the report, because part of what's so interesting is it identifies how it is that millennials are finding accountability at the gym in a life-giving way, and not at the church.
Is this in the same ICF report?
It is not. So if you Google how we gather, and I'll put a link in the PowerPoint for you. If you Google how we gather, you find these two millennials who now are touring the country presenting these 10 places. We also see millennials gathering in very different ways in new monastic communities. We've seen a rise in this. Our own dean at Duke Kennedy School, who came to us from SMU, Elaine Keith, has done a lot of research around
there's a greater chance that that person is actually female. Yes, there are some interesting statistics. I didn't put them in because there is a limit to how many statistics one can learn in a day and still care. But here it is. Like, we're bumping up against it right now. So part of what's interesting in the study is it actually then breaks down, if you do have more than one pastor, do they have discrete responsibilities? Or do they have general parish responsibilities? This is a huge question, frankly, for the formation of new young clergy. Because oftentimes what we assume is that young clergy get mentored by becoming an associate. Well, that's not the case anymore. And so what happens? How are we preparing people as generalists and as specialists to be in ministry according to the medical model? A third of pastors work more than one job, is what the study analysis shows. How many of you are bivocational? Okay.
I didn't have alimony, I would have to be.
I haven't heard that before.
The only thing that lets me do what I'm doing is that I get alimony. I couldn't support myself.
Yeah. Well, and hold that thought, because this is one of the big questions that's coming. How many of you are part-time? Okay, so most of the part-timers are part-time but not bivocational. Is that right? So you don't have another job outside the parish? Okay, all right. We'll come back to that this afternoon. What we also know is that 14% about, give or take, receive no compensation for their work in the parish. This is up. Oftentimes, we were talking to Bill earlier, oftentimes this is the gift of retirees who still want to be in the game, but they don't want full-time responsibilities. So oftentimes they'll just volunteer their services on Sunday morning. Now, this is less true, I should just note, this is less true in mainline traditions. This is less true of us. But this is especially true in non-denominational, smaller membership churches, where, frankly, they just need somebody. And they can't afford to pay them. And most of us are nice people, and so we'll show up. And we trust that people of God still need leadership. And so we'll show up on Sunday morning to help out. 16% of American clergy now serve more than one parish at a time. Are any of you serving more than one church right now?
I used to serve three. My first call was to
Yeah, this especially, as you just noted, for us, this is especially true in rural communities, where oftentimes you have two churches that are not strong enough to stand on their own, and so we'll yoke them together. In some places this works beautifully, and it's brilliant and good. In other places this becomes a three-legged race, and you end up on your face. Frankly, when you take two wounded things and tie them together, or two healed things and tie them together, oftentimes this can cause real problems. We do have an increasing number of lay-led congregations and communities of faith. Of those 10 places, communities that this How We Gather study profile, part of what we know is very few are led by an ordained person. And so people are gathering around commitment and conviction, but they're not gathering with anybody who's been ordained by a church.
So is there a way to know if the function of that is part of the increasing lack of trust and respect for ordination as part of the institutional tradition, or is it an economic thing?
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, your point is well made. It's happening on both sides of the equation. And so there are some congregations where we say we don't have money. And then on the other side, there are some places where it's like, well, even if we did have money.
We don't need no stinking ordination.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the challenges of the individualism of our society, is frankly, when we've I mean, this is one of the challenges we face in a seminary setting, is increasingly large congregations just say, we'll do it ourselves. Because they're going to show up and you're going to teach them things that we don't really care if they know. Like, no one cares if they know the documentary hypothesis. So, like...
I think it goes hand in hand, though, with the anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-establishment distrust that we see societally at large. I mean, look at the presidential election.
Let's not.
But I think we need to recognize to that. But I think that's part of it, that the distrust in public institutions of any sort
Yes.
has increased each decade or year.
Yes, that's actually trend 4. We're actually going to come back and talk all about public confidence in institutions. But yes, I mean, you're raising a really valid point that, I mean, this did not happen overnight, nor is the church isolated in this. But the question about who is leading our communities of faith, what credentials they have, what about their formation, the limits of their authority, how do we talk about the boundaries within ministry, and the shape of evaluation? Increasingly, as the church, big C, needs leadership in small membership congregations that are far-flung, it's much easier to put a layperson in charge of that church and say, keep going, and then eventually that congregation may get hungry and say, well, why can't Joe, who's perfectly lovely, why can't she celebrate Eucharist? Or do we just move to the parish hall and have a feast every week and call it Eucharist? Like, I mean, this is really pushing us. It's pushing ecumenical relationships, and I mean, it's fraught, as you know, in every which way. Who's leading is changing. For those of you who find yourself in this position, for those of you who may be in part-time bivocational ministry, or even if you're not, here's a great resource. My former colleague David Keck, this comes from the Shameless Commerce Division. This is an Alban book called Healthy Churches, Faithful Pastors. And part of what David does is he tries to walk through how do you build a congregation pastor covenant so that you can actually talk about what is reasonable, what's reasonable for you as the pastor, what's reasonable for them as the congregation. How do you build life-changing and life-sustaining relationships one to another? So this is one for yourself if you find yourself in that particular position. Trend 2. If how we gather is different and who is leading is different, these are trends that are changing who we are as the church. There's a third, how we fund ministry. And this is one that none of us really want to talk about on a Tuesday morning. None of us really want to come together and talk about the economics of parish life because, you start poking at this bear and, the bear comes back. And yet, part of what we know is that the realities of parish economics have changed dramatically. Jim Wagner, who was the president of Emory University in 2008, right in the midst of the financial crisis, said this brilliant thing. What the world is experiencing is no passing storm. It is economic climate change. I love the distinction there because so many of us, frankly, me, in 2008, I thought what we were witnessing was some pretty horrendous thunderstorm, maybe even a hurricane. I mean, it was changing everything within our institutional assumptions. It was changing everything about revenue projections. It was changing everything that we had known. But what I didn't imagine, and what I think a lot of us didn't imagine, was that this was actually economic climate change. That our old assumptions would never work in quite the same way again. And so part of the question became, well, if this is the new reality, how do we live and move and have our being in God in this reality? And how do we change what we're assuming is normal? And so increasingly what we're seeing, well, first, survey question. How many of you are still conducting an annual stewardship campaign? Okay, how many of you are finding success in your annual stewardship campaign?
I will.
Yeah.
It doesn't get worse when you conduct the campaign, but you may not see remarkably better.
Right. So if you're not doing this, how are you budgeting? Are you budgeting? Let's just, good. Yeah, and then we'll,
We have, for the last several years, based on projections of, hey, this is what people have given in the past, and making a budget that pushes that a little bit, puts reasons in it.
yeah,
And, we're probably one of the few churches that's never had that right here.
good.
We were budgeting this on faith for a while, but now things are turning around. I mean, we always do past projections.
Mm-hmm.
There were some years where it's like, God's gonna have to step in because we don't have it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The success hasn't been with the annual stewardship, it's with special giving.
Mm-hmm.
When you say, we need money for this, they give.
Yes.
When you say we need money for the church, it's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
When you say, we need it for carpeting, we need it for air conditioning, we need it for this program, or for these, this thing happening, then the money is never short.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yvonne.
We budget to the expenses as we have had for the last year, we're a very small church with projection. What might happen this coming year, if there's a special thing we need, including mission support, we use a jingle club, which I pull the flowers out of a vase, and for 6 weeks, we over and above, we drop them whatever, and that has been successful for us. But, yeah, we were short last year, and Stephanie Taylor, who had a congregation, said, hey, we're short. Two people came up with it, plus a little more, so we're still okay. But my goodness, we are absolutely. But God provided, I need to say that because we even had people that thought they were garden, can't put that on the corn. God was right. But, his work, by faith, but it's hard to know what to do.
Over 40% of our members now use online giving, and so they're committed to their goal this year to try to see under that 60%. The revenue stream increases. So that, to a certain extent, that's not annual. That's right now on a basis. It's going to encourage people to really.
Yeah, and that's both great and also theologically challenging. I know it's like PayPal,
Right.
and so how do you think about it? PayPal just bills me.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute, that has a theological problem. And so how do we think about the both and? One of the times I was thinking in my congregation, we new members coming in, and I've had a lot of new members come in from our churches that are constantly talking about money out of men who they have to work a large plant, have to support large staff, and things like that. And it's like, it's been a little crushing and not always, we don't feel like we're coming out, we really ask for money.
In rural areas, I find that money is a big issue. So rather than address it as an annual stewardship campaign, I look at it as a daily or weekly stewardship campaign. And not based upon necessarily the dollars, but the ministry that we do. And try to help people see that what we're doing is accomplishing this ministry. That's why, and a part of it is, of course, because I'm part-time now,
Mm-hmm.
but we've already collected what they projected you would be.
Yeah. Well, we'll have some good news for you in just a minute. In addition to that, part of what we're hearing pretty consistently across the main line is we're actually moving back toward an older model. And the model we're moving back to is the old cathedral model. That what we have is a network of benefactors. This is especially true in smaller congregations and even bigger congregations. But there's a small group of people who basically underwrite the budget. And then when you get in a crisis at the end of the year or whatever, part of what tends to happen is that somebody picks up the phone and calls one of those benefactors who writes a check for the remaining balance. This is what we're hearing pretty much across the board. In places where this is not happening, though, part of what we see is a collision between increasing economic pressure and, as a result, the cultivation of new and multiple revenue streams along with creative partnerships. So, yeah. Okay. So part of this increasing economic pressure, and this is the thing that's sort of looming over many of our congregations, is many of us have deferred maintenance on our buildings, that at the point it comes due, we're going to need those benefactors. And we're going to need some people, because a lot of congregations are one boiler away from real economic hardship, or one roof away from real economic hardship. A survey of historic properties in Philadelphia, and one of the, frankly, poorer areas of Philadelphia, and congregations in the poorer area, showed each of the buildings had between $1 and $2 million per. Now, oftentimes we want to talk about our buildings as this great asset. A lot of our money and our resources as denominations are bound up in our buildings, and yet there is this looming thing that comes on the other side of that.
Well, that's exactly my congregation's situation. It's a National Historic Landmark in a very poor area, the Fairpark area of Dallas. And then first of May, we had a crisis, and then a man went around and broke all the windows in both buildings, including 100-year-old historic stained glass windows. And this is a campus that's already been neglected for decades. I mean, wiring, plumbing, all kinds of stuff. So historic partnerships with wealthier congregations that had been kind of languishing, now coming anew. That's what is so creative partnerships, multiple revenue streams, grants, and all that kind of stuff. Because there's no way the small 30-some people in this church can sustain.
And so, as we think about this cultivation of multiple revenue streams, congregations are doing really interesting things. Take this. You know this church? Marble Collegiate in New York City. Part of what Marble Collegiate realized is that they have a building sitting right next door that has some space in it. And there are some people in Manhattan who need places to live. And there are some people who would really love to live right there in Manhattan. And so they renovated part of their building and turned it into apartments. And now they have a monthly source of income that's supporting their ministry. All because they have apartments sitting in the church office. Now, you're like, okay, I'm in rural Texas. There's quite the demand. But I really want to live in a church fellowship hall. I mean, there isn't that demand in your setting, maybe. But part of what becomes really interesting is thinking about what's the model. Because a lot of us are actually land barons, and we don't know it. A lot of us in rural areas, the church sits on a good amount of land, and there are ways that we can actually leverage that land for the good of the community, but also to help balance our budget. Were you all caught up in it happened a few years ago that in rural areas, a lot of churches got letters asking to put cell towers in steeples? Did you get these letters? And basically, phone companies would send you a check for renting the space above your building. No? That's the question. Do you do it? How do you wrestle with it? Sorry. Yes. We should take a break. I think this is the voice of God speaking. Yeah. Stand and then break.
One of the churches in our area that is, they have two sides.
Yeah.
Their second side is mainly a fitness center. It's the second side. It has educational, and then they converted on Sundays the gymnasium. Comes down, brings a big screen, stage for their band. They've got the boy band is in that. And
No, it's okay.
We'll keep going on.
Yeah. So can we try that?
Sure.
It
Yes.
should work.
Let me run to the restroom
Yeah,
before I
yeah,
do
you're
this.
good.
I've
And then do you need water or anything?
One of those things I did think about was that we should have had you wearing that. Yeah.
And then ideally we would like then have like for questions, you know, about the story. So no, I'm learning all this.
Yeah.
So go back.
See, I told you we were unorganized.
See, we're learning together. Exactly.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this day, this is a learning day for me and for much of our process, and didn't think about the fact that we really need to have the mic situation better for the sake of people who are going to be watching online either as we are going or later. So we will be running around with the microphones for those of you who have questions or comments to add. And Nathan is now fully wired, so I think we're good to go. So back to Nathan. Yes.
Yeah, you're now on the record. Yes, so thank you for bearing with us, and
Jason will
thank
run
you.
around too, I think.
In case you can't tell, I'm pretty excited about this stuff because I think it does highlight some real opportunities in our mission field. And so I'm sorry that I just started blowing through a break because, this is good stuff to me. And thank you to those of you who are watching at home who did the last hour and a half just lip reading. That's pretty impressive, frankly. So in addition to Marble Collegiate Church, other churches are finding new ways of bringing in additional revenue and finding creative other partnerships. Here's another example. This one comes from my backyard, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the Pee Wee Homes Project. It's named for a 71-year-old homeless man. It's named for a 71-year-old homeless man who is actually going to be the first resident of these new tiny homes that a church is building on its land. And so what it did was this congregation reached out to the city, it reached out to other grant funders and said, if we could address homelessness on our property, would you give us a grant? And so part of what's happened is the town and other grant funders are investing in the congregation in the land that they already have to address this civic problem. And so it represents a different kind of revenue generating opportunity as well as a different way of actually building creative partnerships to solve a community problem. This is exciting. Now, I promised Bill additional good news. The smaller the congregation you serve, the more they give. That's the good news. And now we actually have data to back that up. In the 2012 National Congregation Study, what we see is that as a congregation grows larger, giving decreases. And this is true across evangelical congregations, mainline Black, Protestant, and Catholic churches. So the pattern holds no matter what size congregation you are in. Part of it is easily explicable, right? Because the smaller the congregation, the greater the sense that everybody has to come together. And one of the challenges of being a pastor or in a larger congregation is there isn't that same sense of we all have to pull together. And so people tend to give less. The larger, it's sort of the tyranny of the commons. The more people you get, the less each person feels responsible for what is actually happening in the life of the congregation. Now, there's some other bad news, actually, if you're Chris. As a percentage of congregational income, congregations are giving less to their denominations now than they were in '98. Some of this is intentional, as denominations have rebudgeted, but some of this is also not intentional. This is congregations balancing their own budgets by saying, I can't pay the denomination this year, which is a dangerous trend, but it's also a trend that we're observing. Parallel that also with a congregational sense that says, what have you done for me lately? And so part of the challenge for folks who are serving in denominational roles is this question about how do they balance their budget? This graph should actually be upside down, 98, 2006, and 2012, so you can see it declining. My Excel skills and PowerPoint skills are not that advanced. I should just confess that. But, I mean, this is a huge challenge for denominational folks and for congregations. And for all of us as we think about what does it mean to be the church in a region and not just the church in a congregation. How do we make sense of this and what do we do with these kinds of numbers? So trend number 3, how we fund ministry is changing. Yeah.
The cost of healthcare.
Hang on one second. Yeah.
The cost and annual increase in healthcare in the ELCA has been tremendous.
Yes.
And that has really, it has put a strain on our budget at Messiah as, like a 25% increase, it seems like almost every year for the past many years.
Yeah.
And I wonder if congregations are paying for that out of what they might give as benevolence, as we call it, to the Synod office.
Yeah, that is obviously one of the increasing economic pressures on congregations, and it's also one of the motivators for reducing clergy time. So we'll move from a full-time to a half-time without benefits. Now, some of this is tradition dependent because I don't know, at what point do you have to offer benefits in the ELCA?
30 hours.
30 hours a week? Okay. Thank you. Phone a friend. This becomes one of those things. Congregations start looking and they say, well, we could do with a 20-hour pastor and save this money on benefits, which is not really a mission-driven decision, just to note the obvious.
But it does reflect the reality that their constituents are facing as well. There's less and less benefits available to everyone.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and frankly, when I look at some of the people in my pews, we don't have pews, but if we did, when I look at them, part of what they look at is my total compensation package, which if that looks out of line with the lives that they live, and what they can afford, it gets really hard because I'm the one who has to explain to them, no, really, you have to pay this. And so how we navigate these tensions really does matter. And the answer can't just be we're going to reduce everybody to 20 hours so that we don't have to pay anything in benefits. Trend 4. Our supporting institutions are in flux. Now what do I mean by that? I mean the institutions that have historically come around local congregations. They're changing. So everything from your local seminary, or the seminary that sends most people to your area, to foundations, to the denominational structures themselves. All of those support systems that congregations used to have in place have shifted and are still shifting. And so congregations used to be able to rely on certain things being just provided or being in the air, and yet now they're not here. And so what does that mean? How do we deal with both a decline in institutions, some institutions that are renewing, and then this, as Deb was pointing us to earlier, this general decline in public confidence in institutions as a whole? That's a real challenge. That's a huge challenge for local congregations for today. Gregory Shea of the Wharton School described it this way: we're in an environment that's permanent whitewater. It's not a steady state change kind of environment where you can catch your breath between. It's permanent whitewater. Now this, taken alongside, this is economic climate change, starts to explain new realities. If institutions are forever sort of in this role and in this turmoil, it raises questions about local congregation stability, health, resources. I mean, frankly, the closure of the Alban Institute was a canary in the coal mine for mainline churches. I mean, part of it was built on an economic model that wasn't sustainable anymore. The question becomes, where in the vestiges of these institutions do we find hope and do we find new life? Where is it when we look at the ecology? Those of you who are familiar with the Lilly Endowment, you know that Lilly talks a lot about the ecology of the church. It's not your local congregation, it's the whole system. Where do we find within the whole ecology evidence of new life springing? How is it we hold on to those glimpses of new life and keep putting them before people? Because oftentimes what our people are hearing are voices like this one. Somebody? Thank you, Ferguson. Wrote this book, The Great Degeneration, which is basically about institutional collapse. And if you read this book, you go into an immediate depression. Because you read this book and basically it says all of the structures that you have built your life around, all of the structures that you have come to rely on are actually eroding. And so what will remain? And he's not terribly optimistic and sort of has this like vision of society where we're all in like those big Humvee tanks driving down the streets trying to avoid each other, which was sort of like I-35 yesterday. But, you know, at the same time, I do want to say this is sort of the outsider voice, the most negative, the most cynical about what's happening. There are places where our institutions are being revitalized, and places where institutions that support congregations are finding new life and birth. But that's hard. It's hard to find those places. Add to this mix, when we talk about the decline of public confidence, what is happening between red America and blue America. And here, I want to name two trends for us without getting political. We'll see how I do. When we think about red America and blue America, part of this phenomenon is what might be called the rise of ideological enclaves. That increasingly, we don't have to associate with people we don't agree with. And this is now bleeding over to Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night programming. Increasingly, people are showing up, and the people we surround ourselves with are confirming whatever bias we bring to the world. You know this phrase from psychology, confirmation bias. If you need an example of what this looks like, if you watched MSNBC or Fox News after the first presidential debate, you saw it. Because it was voices within a vacuum reiterating what the viewers of Fox News or MSNBC already believed. Hillary won by a landslide. Donald defeated her. And what we see is that it's harder and harder to find alternative voices. It's harder and harder to hear the voices of people who disagree with us already. This is challenging our institutions, because our institutions historically have been able to broaden people's perspective and actually keep people coming to the table who disagree with each other. Yeah.
It also is reflected in our snarkiness as we express some of our things here. So,
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. I'm indicted. So confession over lunch, how about that? So this is one phenomenon. The other phenomenon, and here there's a great book called The Fractured Republic. You don't have time to read it between now and election day, so I'm going to give you the cliff notes so you can preach on it anyway. This book highlights a common phenomenon that is true whether you're a red American or a blue American. And the common phenomenon is nostalgia. The question is, what are we nostalgic for? And red America and blue America are nostalgic for different things. But what you notice is they're both nostalgic. If you listen to the rhetoric from both right and left, or right and left, if you listen to the rhetoric from folks, what you hear is that there was once upon a time this glorious thing, and somehow we have all lost it. But what we're trying to climb back towards, well, that depends. We're either trying to climb back to the 50s and 60s, if you're on the left, or you're trying to climb back to the 80s, or to the Ozzie and Harriet of the 50s that was never really true, but people perceive that it was. And so our institutions, as they're trying to hold people together, are combating the vision of a world that never was. And so part of it, as leaders in congregations, whether clergy or laity, part of what you have to do, this is the only time I'm going to get preachy today, I promise. Part of what you have to do is challenge nostalgia. Because if you're looking back, there's no hopeful vision. If you think about, those of you who are lectionary preachers, you may have heard Jeremiah this past Sunday about planting vineyards and about buying land and about setting up homes in an exiled land. And part of it is this whole challenge to the people of God to be forward thinking, to not sit and say, well, you know, we're really missing home, but to actually plant vineyards and to build community and to think about what the future is. This is one of those trends. This is one of the trends that's shaping our congregational life, is this backward looking to the glory days rather than the hopeful looking to God's future. Depressed? Good. Good. Yeah. It's hard. It is. It's very hard to do that. And on November 9th, half of us are going to be unhappy.
So one of the things that you talked about challenging the nostalgia, but the nostalgia is not on our consciousness necessarily. So there needs to be a place for unpacking it, for admitting it, for confessing it, and the need to be able to listen. That's the challenge, because we're so used to being in our enclaves of the people who support me in my position, to be able to listen to those, if we're nostalgic for the 60s and 70s, to listen to those who are nostalgic for the 50s or the 80s or whatever, and be able to then lay it aside to look toward the future as well.
And to complicate the nostalgia, to be able to say, you know what, that the world you're longing for never actually existed. Right. This is all true. And you know, part of it too is the complication of racism, sexism, classism, all of the isms that then get bound up in this world that I no longer have.
But not unpacking this is what leads to the shame that we were talking about earlier.
Repeat that.
But not unpacking this is what leads to the shame that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
We're not good enough, whatever it is.
Right. And our congregation began declining somewhere in like 1950 when it was at its peak, and now we're nothing compared to what we were. Other comments? So the fourth trend, all those supporting institutions, including our cultural institutions, are in flux, and that's changing our congregation's dynamics. It's changing how we're the people of God together. Now, we could go on, and you wouldn't like that. There are other trends that are worth noting. There are other trends that are shaping congregational life that are worth paying attention to. Trends like globalization. What does it mean that we now live in a world with porous borders? Even if it's just porous borders when it comes to information. Jason's tweeting, right? Okay. I'm psychic. Part of the question is that's going global. Well, what do you do with that? How do we think about that? Which brings us to technology. How do we think and how do we engage as congregations in questions of technology? How do we engage questions of environmentalism and creation care? An increasing number of congregations are having creation seasons within the life of their church to pay attention to the moral dimensions of environmentalism. We live in a multinodal world. Isn't that a great phrase? What this means is we no longer live in a world where Washington was the only city that mattered. Now, that world never really existed, but we believed it did. And part of what a multinodal world means is that spheres of influence are global. And that the way, what happens in London, think about Brexit. What happens in Brexit suddenly had an impact in our stock market, and you were driving in Dallas and you got an alert from your broker. Or something like that. You can play it out again and again. To take the more negative example, a pastor in Gainesville, Florida, threatens to burn the Quran. Within 24 hours, there's a statement from the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Within 48 hours, there was a statement from the President of the United States and a statement from the Pope denouncing some guy whose church was smaller than this room, but who was about to blow up Gainesville, Florida. Now, that's a multinodal world. This little outpost shook global powers. And then, of course, the rise of Pentecostalism and evangelicalism. This is especially true in the church in the global south, not exclusively, but certainly true there. We're seeing an explosion of Pentecostal presence, evangelicalism, and that's shaping the church here. You know that there are now what are called reverse missions, where for so long we've been the senders in our own minds, if not in fact, and increasingly the U.S. is being evangelized. There it is. Evangelized in reverse for this thing that we have lost. That's shaping the church. Did you want to?
It seems to me also that there's this trend where everybody gets to pick their own facts. I mean, there is no longer really a belief in the statistics and the factual information. It's just like people can just choose their own information. And I think that's also part of the whole internet thing.
It is. I mean, we've gone from Walter Cronkite, that's the way it is, to, well, that's the way your life is. And so I can customize all my own news. I mean, that's the confirmation bias question. Other statements or questions? Now, here's my fundamental commitment to you. These are not so much decisions to be made. The wrong question is, what do we do about it? The right question is, what's the conversation we need to have about it? How do we actually engage these trends and topics? How do we think about how they're showing up in our lives and in our ministries? And so for the next 10 minutes, we'll start you in table conversation around how are these trends showing up in your own ministry, and how are you responding to them? And then, if you are that rare person in the room that none of these trends describe what you're experiencing, what trends are you noticing? What trends would you name in your own context that are shaping your life and ministry? It is now 52 minutes past the hour. We'll take cue 10 minutes? 15? Sounds good. All right. We'll take 15 minutes around your table for a conversation around these questions, and then we'll be back.
I didn't say much here, so I can report what others did. The biggest thing we talked about is validating people's nostalgia, and then bringing them around to not a validation of what you think you remember, but a validation of actuality. And a part of that is in ministry, you have to dig down to find out what the pain is before you can do anything. And trying to just go into a church and change it without going to that, change doesn't happen, or transformation has a hard time happening.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, we were right there, what you're talking about. It. The trend, I think, that I'm dealing with most now is the institutions in flux. What once was a large and vibrant church that did a lot of ministry, now the people that are there are few and older, there's less money, and so how do they understand that they can no longer do everything that traditionally has been their legacy? And they feel the frustration and the shame. So trying to do that creative partnering, and I don't like the word benefactor, it sounds too much like patronage, but how do we nurture relationships that are more in that accompaniment model that we talk about in Global Mission? And how do I, as a pastor, help them see all the gifts they have to give, to share with people who would come and work with us and help support us financially and with volunteer hours? But where's the common ground and the equality to be found there? Because even while a leader is trying to move the people forward into this new reality, they're never going to go as fast as I wish they would. So I have to pull back and pastor them where they are now, baby steps, and that's real challenging.
I mean, we were kind of all over the map, I think, but I think a lot of it was kind of this question of how do we take the wisdom that our traditions come out of and bring that into the questions that are being asked today. I mean, I think that's would kind of summarize where a lot of our conversation ended up going is, well, we have this Lutheran tradition or foundation of where we are, but how does that apply? Where are the things, what are those touchstones that we can pull from that still speak into the questions that people may be asking or the expectations they may be having?
Other things?
Well, we were looking at the kind of the fear sometimes is in the institutional church, and how that's modeled in the environment too, and how sometimes people are afraid to commit to the future, as you all were reflecting on too. But and it's kind of looking back and needing, I guess, reassurance or something. Needing reassurance that instead of looking at stuff just to kind of meet the budget, that we looked at the vision and how can people get behind that instead of just seeing kind of meeting the bills and just surviving. One of the things that I had mentioned too was I have a niece. One of my brother's families has been a part of the fellowship church kind of mentality, and my other family members are Lutheran. But anyway, I have learned kind of a little bit about that the small groups that they have, I think, is really one of the things that keeps people connected to those congregations. I think if they are not connected to that probably doesn't work very well. But it is effective, I think, in the sense that for millennials, perhaps, because my niece is a 24-year-old and new teacher in the Fort Worth area, and she's connected with that large Christ Chapel, which is just down the street from Trinity Lutheran, and talks about how she really she's able to connect socially with people, and that's really helpful for her to make, to establish some safe relationships, or that she feels are safe and healthy. And so, anyway, it's perhaps something we could learn, maybe from the mega churches. Just one way to incorporate people and help them to feel that sense of community. So.
All right. Were there any other trends you named around your table that you haven't heard mentioned yet that you think are shaping congregational life?
I was just mentioning to Pastor that for a while when we were struggling with who we were going to be, because our worship was down sometimes to less than 20 every Sunday, we started articulating things like we are small but mighty, and uplifting all the ministry we did, per capita. And, that takes you out of the shame, because now you may be saying, well, they're a mega church, but in comparison, look what we are doing with our small numbers. And I think that you have to kind of help people reimagine that.
Because the numbers, that really worked well, that positiveness, because now the numbers at worship are like 35 to 45.
It's not so much the trend that we talked about, but one of the things I've been tracking and thinking about as we talk about different communities, and what I think is a significant trend is within institutions, you had to get older and older and older before you had power and voice. And some people never, would hit a ceiling. We live in a world now where sometimes you need to be younger and younger. As our churches are looking how do we social network, how do we do other things. Suddenly, it's younger people who are having a voice, and how many parents are making decisions about the church they attend by what their 3-year-old or 4-year-old feels about the ministry as well. And so, that's something that we're really trying to figure out to pay attention to too.
One of the dynamics I've watched happen over a few decades is that some of the things you named were present in the churches when I was young, and not an active live thing that came out, but it was under there.
Yes.
Thank you. I was reading something about the church gathered and the church scattered. And I think we're talking about the church gathered and how we gather and so forth. And I was just wondering if there's any study on the church scattered, meaning is it more difficult to verbalize what you believe today because it's not politically correct, etc., and you will be frowned upon, or are we more fearful in terms of sharing our faith? What's going on in the church scattered, which is, I think, what really counts ultimately, the Monday to Saturday translation of our faith into action.
It's a complicated question. The short answer to your question is, what we know is that most congregations' work in the world is through hunger relief. If a church has an outreach ministry of any kind, that is the most common outreach ministry that exists. In terms of questions about public witness and questions of either evangelism or what does the gospel look like in the public square, it's sort of all over the map. some congregations are incredibly politically active and see that as their evangelism. Others are more what we would call traditionally evangelical, encouraging speaking on behalf of the faith to others who are not yet in church. Part of the complication of the latter is that trust in religious leaders and trust in religious institutions is at a 4-decade low. And this afternoon we'll talk a little bit about, so this is your teaser, a little bit about why that is, what has happened to trust, and how do we lead in a way that rebuilds trust while responding to these trends, patterns, and realities of our life together. So the short answer is stay tuned. So, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to contribute a little bit when we are thinking about how people meet. I will think in terms of how frequent people meet. They meet only once a week, a Sunday, and that's it. Or they meet in between for Bible studies, because once you get people involved in the ministry, actually they become active, and that will help them to be in track, and you will have them to attend frequently. And another thing, actually, to find a way that is really convenient for them to participate in supporting the congregation, whether in fund or in any different way. I think that will help the church to be active and move forward.
We didn't talk about this at our table, but in terms of financially, those trends, one of the things that was helpful to us is we rent our church to another church, a Hispanic church that's actually more Pentecostal, and we have some other revenue streams that have enabled us to be financially viable when we were in really hard economic times. And so I think you have to be open to doing things a little bit different financially as well.
That's true. Let me ask you to hold off till after lunch. We will now process to lunch in a very formal way.
We're having a debate, Tina, about whether it's shorter and quicker to go out this way or to go out this way. Oh, I always thought it was shorter to go that way. Okay, so you can go out this door. Well, follow people who know. And either go this way and go across over there, or go out this way and follow the driveway to go to lunch. I would say, I'm thinking probably the smoother way would be to go this way, because it's all driveway, sidewalk and driveway. That way you're on more trails. So, yeah, we could. Who wants to? Okay. Before we go, let's have grace. Is there anybody have a favorite camp song, Camp Grace? All right, I'll just pray. All right. Gracious God, we thank you for the ways you feed our body and our spirit. We head out now to feed the body, and we pray that you will strengthen us for your work and for the afternoon ahead. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
What time should we be back?
What time do you want us back? Lunch is official.